The theater of Roman terror, the Roman Empire, did not simply execute its enemies. It destroyed them, body, spirit, and memory, in ways calculated to horrify anyone who might consider defiance. For over 5 centuries, Rome perfected the art of public punishment, transforming death into a spectacle that served the state's most critical function: absolute control through absolute fear. Other ancient civilizations killed their enemies. The Romans understood something darker. They recognized that a quick death taught nothing. A man beheaded in private warned no one, but a man dying slowly over days in full public view, his suffering witnessed by thousands, his remains denied proper burial, that man became a message written in flesh and bone. Roman punishment operated on a simple principle: the pain inflicted must exceed any possible benefit of resistance. The humiliation must strip away every shred of human dignity, and the spectacle must reach the widest possible audience. Executions happened in public spaces and along major roads where maximum numbers of citizens would encounter the results firsthand. The methods Rome employed against dissenters, rebels, slaves, and political enemies represent some of the most systematic cruelty ever devised by a state apparatus. These were not random acts of violence or the excesses of individual tyrants. They were policy, codified in law, refined over generations, and deployed with bureaucratic precision. The empire kept detailed records of punishments administered across provinces and maintained professional executioners trained in specific methods. Manuals circulated among officials describing proper techniques for maximizing suffering while minimizing the chance of premature death. What follows is an examination of how Rome treated those who challenged its authority. The details are difficult to read. They were far more difficult to experience. Death by slow suffocation, the mechanism of crucifixion, death remains misunderstood. Even today, by most who encounter the subject, blood loss from nail wounds did not kill the condemned person on the cross at all. The body can survive puncture wounds through hands and feet without fatal hemorrhage occurring whatsoever. What actually killed was something far more drawn out and medically horrifying in its progression. Suspension with extended arms creates an impossible physiological situation for the human respiratory system to sustain. The intercostal muscles and diaphragm cannot function properly under the weight of a hanging torso. Carbon dioxide builds in the bloodstream while oxygen levels plummet toward critical thresholds rapidly. The only way to draw breath requires pushing the entire body upward using legs nailed through bone and tendon. Each desperate push brings a few seconds of air before exhaustion collapses the body downward again. Strong men repeated this excruciating cycle for 40 hours or longer before their bodies failed. Roman executioners understood this physiology through centuries of practical observation and refinement throughout the empire. When authorities wanted to accelerate death as occasional mercy, soldiers broke the legs using heavy iron bars. This crurifrigum made pushing upward impossible and brought suffocation within minutes rather than days of agony. The condemned sometimes begged for this bone-shattering mercy after endless hours suspended in the breathing cycle. Scourging preceded the cross in virtually all documented Roman crucifixions throughout the imperial period without exception. The flagrum removed strips of flesh with each stroke delivered by trained specialists in the punishment. Victims lost significant blood volume and entered shock states before ever seeing the cross prepared for them. The condemned carried the horizontal crossbeam called the patibulum through streets to the execution site outside walls. This beam weighed between 75 and 100 pounds, tied across the shoulders during procession. Citizens lined these routes to observe the parade of the doomed toward their waiting deaths ahead. Executioners possessed considerable discretion in how they affixed bodies to the assembled cross structure at sites. Josephus documented soldiers in Jerusalem competing to devise novel positions during mass crucifixions following revolt. Some victims hung inverted, with blood pooling in their skulls, creating intense pressure before eventual death arrived. Seneca recorded, witnessing men impaled through their groin on the vertical stake with arms then stretched above. The cross stood at eye level along roads carrying heavy commercial and civilian traffic on daily basis. Placement ensured maximum exposure to passersby, who could observe every stage of deterioration from nailing through decomposition. Survival occasionally occurred. When influential parties intervened before death completed its full course on condemned individuals, Josephus himself successfully petitioned Emperor Titus to remove 3 crucified acquaintances still living on their crosses. Even with immediate medical attention provided afterward, 2 of the 3 died from their wounds shortly following removal. The placement of nails through the body followed specific anatomical knowledge developed over centuries of practice by Roman executioners. Nails driven through wrists between radius and ulna bones provided secure attachment without tearing free under body weight. Palms lacked sufficient bone structure to support suspension for extended periods. A small wooden seat called the settle sometimes extended from the vertical beam, allowing victims to partially rest their weight, and thereby prolonging the ordeal significantly beyond what unsupported hanging would permit. The Appian Way in 73 BCE, approximately 70 gladiators escaped from a training school in Capua, using kitchen implements as their only weapons. Their leader was a Thracian named Spartacus, who had once served in Roman auxiliary forces before his enslavement. Within months, this small band of escapees had grown into an army of nearly 90,000 slaves, freedmen, and desperate poor seeking liberation from Roman oppression. For 2 years, this slave army defeated every Roman force sent against them with embarrassing regularity. They crushed Praetorian armies, humiliated consular legions, and plundered wealthy estates across southern Italy without facing meaningful opposition. The Senate watched in disbelief as trained military units fell to former household servants wielding stolen weapons. The senator Marcus Licinius Crassus finally volunteered to end the rebellion at his own considerable expense. He raised 8 legions and pursued the rebels with methodical brutality across the Italian peninsula. The final battle occurred in 71 BCE, where Spartacus made his last stand against overwhelming Roman numbers. He died fighting, though his body was never identified among thousands of rebel dead scattered across the battlefield. What followed became the most concentrated display of Roman cruelty in recorded history until that time. 6,000 captured survivors received identical sentences without trial or individual consideration of their circumstances whatsoever. Soldiers erected crosses at intervals of 35 yards along both sides of the Appian Way, stretching 130 miles from Capua to Rome itself. The condemned were nailed up in sequence over several days as construction crews worked ahead of execution teams. Travelers approaching Rome heard the screaming before they saw the first cross on the horizon ahead of them. The sound grew louder with each mile as thousands of voices merged into a continuous wail of agony echoing across the countryside. Merchants reported hearing this chorus of suffering from several miles' distance on still mornings throughout the region. The stench became unbearable within the first week as infection spread through wounds across thousands of suspended bodies simultaneously. Those approaching the capital covered their faces with cloth soaked in perfume or vinegar to endure passage through this corridor. Roman officials conducting state business traveled the road surrounded by slaves burning incense in desperate attempts to mask the overwhelming smell. Slaves throughout Italy received reports of the Appian Way from returning travelers and merchants visiting their estates. Masters ensured their household slaves heard detailed descriptions of what lined the road to Rome now. The message required no official explanation or proclamation from Senate authorities to achieve its intended purpose. No large-scale slave rebellion ever occurred in Roman territory again after this display. The crosses remained standing for months as weather and wildlife reduced. The bodies to skeletal remains still hanging from iron nails. Travelers reported seeing bones scattered beneath posts for years afterward along certain stretches of the road. Damnatio ad bestias. The practice entered Roman tradition in 167 BCE, when General Aemilius Paulus ordered army deserters crushed beneath elephants following his victory over Macedonia. His son expanded the concept after conquering Carthage by introducing large predatory cats into the execution repertoire. What began as military punishment evolved into scheduled morning programming at venues throughout the empire over the following centuries of Roman dominance. Lions arrived from North Africa through extensive capture and transport networks, maintained by specialized merchants serving imperial demand. Bears came from forests in Germania and the northern provinces where trappers worked dangerous expeditions to supply the arenas. Leopards, panthers, wolves, and wild boars filled out the roster of killing animals maintained in facilities beneath every major venue. The Colosseum alone housed hundreds of creatures in underground chambers connected by tunnels and mechanical lifts designed specifically for this purpose. Training these animals to attack humans required expertise that Romans developed into professional craft over many generations. Wild predators do not naturally assault people without considerable conditioning and preparation first. Keepers starved the creatures for extended periods before scheduled events to sharpen their aggression and hunger substantially. They fed them human flesh from executed criminals to develop strong preference for it over other available meat sources. Complete darkness in holding cells increased agitation, so animals emerged into arena sunlight. Victims entered through separate gates positioned around the arena floor at strategic intervals for maximum dramatic effect. Some found themselves bound to wooden stakes with arms extended and legs tied completely immobile against the post. Others received crude weapons fashioned from soft wood that splintered uselessly on first contact with animal hide. A third category entered naked and empty-handed to simply flee until caught by pursuing predators somewhere on the sand. Theatrical elements transformed certain executions into mythological reenactments with elaborate costumes and specially constructed props. A prisoner dressed as Orpheus sat playing a lyre while trained bears approached from multiple entry points around him. Women condemned for various offenses were sometimes bound to wooden frames shaped like animals in elaborate staging. The creativity of execution methods varied with the budget and imagination of the official sponsoring that day. Arena staff managed the pacing of deaths using fire, noise, and additional animal releases to extend or shorten specific encounters. Metal doors controlled which creatures entered and when during the course of morning execution programs. Attendants carrying hot irons drove animals back temporarily if officials wanted prolonged struggle from a particular victim. Bodies were dragged from the sand using large metal hooks after confirmation of death by attending arena physicians. Servants raked fresh sand over bloodstains before the next condemned prisoner entered through the gates to face waiting animals. Certain condemned prisoners faced combinations of animals, released simultaneously to create chaos on the arena floor below. Lions and bears, competing for the same victim, sometimes fought each other while the prisoner watched from temporary safety. Officials wagered on which species would claim the kill first during these coordinated releases. The unpredictability added excitement for spectators who had grown accustomed to straightforward single-animal encounters over years of regular attendance at morning programs. The prescriptions in 82 BCE, the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla introduced a mechanism of political murder that had never existed in Roman governance before his rise. He ordered wooden tablets erected in the Forum, bearing names of men declared enemies of the state through his authority alone. Anyone whose name appeared on these lists lost all legal protection instantly upon publication of the tablets. The rules were simple and terrifying in their clarity for all Roman citizens to understand completely. Any person could kill a prescribed man and face no legal consequence of any kind whatsoever. The killer received a bounty of 12,000 sesterces for a senator and half that amount for men of lower rank. Slaves who betrayed their masters received freedom plus the full cash reward for their information. Even family members could collect payment for turning in their own blood relatives to the authorities. Sulla began with 80 names on the initial tablets posted that first morning in the Forum. By the end of the week, the number had grown to several hundred as supporters requested additions. Personal enemies, business rivals, and wealthy men with desirable property found themselves added to subsequent lists through the influence of those seeking profit and revenge simultaneously. The killing spread across Italy as copies of the tablets reached municipal authorities in distant towns and cities. Local officials in Larinum received authorization to execute 4 councillors whose names appeared on lists sent from Rome. Men who had never engaged in politics died because someone with connections wanted their farms or their wives, or simply held old grudges against them. Bounty hunters roamed the streets, searching for faces matching descriptions circulated alongside the names on official lists. Some proscribed men were caught dining with friends who immediately turned on them for the reward money. Others were betrayed by household slaves who saw opportunity for freedom and wealth through a single act of denunciation. The heads of executed men were brought to the Forum and displayed on the speaker platform where orators had once debated philosophy and law. Sulla reportedly examined each head personally to confirm the identity of his enemies before authorizing payment to those who delivered them. The platform accumulated dozens of severed heads during the months of active proscription throughout Rome. Property of the condemned transferred immediately to state control for auction at prices favoring Sulla supporters exclusively. Entire families lost generational wealth overnight when a single name appeared on the mourning tablets posted in the Forum Square. Decades later, the second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus revived prescription following Julius Caesar's assassination. They added over 300 senators and 2,000 wealthy equestrians to death lists. During their consolidation of power, the orator Cicero died in this second wave when soldiers caught him fleeing Italy by litter. Collective punishment, Roman law, contained provisions that extended guilt far beyond the individual who committed an offense against authority or property. The principle held that those surrounding a criminal shared responsibility for failing to prevent the act or report intentions beforehand. This legal framework transformed entire households into targets for state violence based on proximity alone. When a slave killed his owner, every enslaved person in that household faced execution, regardless of their involvement or knowledge. The law assumed conspiracy among slaves and demanded complete elimination of everyone who might have participated in planning. A wealthy Roman might own hundreds of slaves across multiple properties who would all die for the action of a single individual among them. In 61 CE, the urban prefect, Lucius Pedonius Secundus, was stabbed by one of his slaves over a personal dispute involving a promised freedom. The Senate invoked ancient law, requiring execution of all 400 slaves in his household, without any exception whatsoever. Public outcry erupted across Rome as citizens protested the killing of innocent men, women, and children who clearly had no part in the murder at all. The emperor deployed soldiers to line the execution route and ensure the sentences were carried out against every single person in the household. The senator Gaius Cassius Longinus argued before his colleagues that mercy would encourage future slave violence. Throughout Rome, he insisted that fear alone kept the massive slave population under control in a city where the enslaved outnumbered free citizens. His speech carried the vote, and 400 people died because one man committed murder in anger. Families of those condemned for treason against the emperor faced consequences extending across generations without limit. Sons could never hold public office or serve in any governmental capacity throughout their entire lives. Grandsons inherited the same restrictions and social exclusion from their fathers before them automatically. Daughters became unmarriageable to ambitious families seeking political advancement through strategic unions. The bloodline itself became contaminated by a single conviction that echoed through descendants for decades afterward. Property seizure accompanied these generational punishments and stripped families of economic foundation completely. Estates accumulated over centuries transferred to imperial treasury through single acts of condemnation against one family member. Children watched their fathers dragged from homes by soldiers acting on denunciation from neighbors or servants. Wives found themselves suddenly homeless and without legal standing to contest seizures occurring before their eyes. The destruction of Jerusalem in 66 CE. The Jewish population of Judea rose against Roman occupation after the governor Gessius Florus looted the sacred temple treasury. Initial rebel successes shocked imperial authorities when Jewish forces defeated a Syrian legion at Beth Horon and seized control of Jerusalem entirely. Rome dispatched the experienced General Vespasian to crush the uprising with overwhelming military force at his command. Vespasian systematically reduced Galilee and surrounding territories over 2 years, before political events in Rome interrupted his campaign completely. Following Nero's suicide and a chaotic succession struggle among rival claimants, Vespasian himself claimed the imperial throne and departed for the capital immediately. His son Titus assumed command of operations against Jerusalem with 4 full legions and numerous auxiliary units totaling over 60,000 soldiers. Titus arrived outside the city walls in April of 70 CE during the Passover festival. When the population had swelled substantially with pilgrims from distant provinces, he permitted worshippers to enter for religious observances, but sealed all exits completely afterward without warning. This deliberate timing trapped perhaps 1 million people inside fortifications designed for a fraction of that number originally. Roman engineers constructed a circumvallation wall approximately 7 kilometers long, encircling the entire city within mere days of arrival. No food entered Jerusalem after this barrier closed around the population trapped inside the walls. Famine took hold within weeks as stored grain ran out and prices for basic sustenance reached impossible levels. A measure of wheat sold for a talent of silver, while people collapsed dead in streets from starvation daily. Mothers reportedly consumed their own infants, according to accounts preserved from survivors who witnessed the horror firsthand. Bodies accumulated faster than the living could dispose of them and were thrown from walls into valleys below. Battering rams, suspended from massive wooden frames, pounded defensive walls continuously, day and night, without pause. Siege towers rolled forward on constructed ramps, allowing soldiers to fight defenders at equal elevation along the fortifications. Roman engineers tunneled beneath foundations, causing sections of wall to collapse suddenly into the passages dug below them. The temple fell in August, when flames consumed the central sanctuary, under circumstances ancient sources still debate today. The city burned systematically as legions worked through neighborhoods, putting everyone to the sword, regardless of age or condition. Ancient accounts claim over 1 million dead, though modern estimates suggest several 100,000 perished during the siege and its immediate aftermath. 97,000 survivors were marched away in chains to destinations across the empire and beyond its borders entirely. Titus celebrated his victory with elaborate triumphal procession through Rome, displaying captured Jewish leaders and sacred temple objects, including the golden menorah. Coins minted afterward bore the inscription Judea Capta, announcing the complete subjugation of the rebellious province to citizens throughout the empire. Poenocale and other horrors beyond the major categories of punishment that Rome deployed against enemies and criminals existed, specialized torments reserved for specific offenses. These methods demonstrated creative cruelty that went far beyond simple execution into realms of suffering designed for particular crimes and particular messages. Poenocale targeted those who murdered their own parents or close family members with premeditation. The condemned was first beaten with rods stained red until blood flowed freely from wounds covering the entire body surface. Executioners then forced the bleeding person into a large leather sack alongside 4 living animals selected for symbolic meaning and practical viciousness in confined spaces. A dog represented the lack of loyalty shown by the murderer to sacred family bonds of obligation. A venomous serpent embodied the treacherous nature of killing one's own blood relations who gave life. A rooster symbolized the unnatural violation of familial duty that defined the crime itself under law. A monkey represented the mockery made of human relationships through such an abhorrent act. The sack was sewn shut with all occupants alive and struggling inside together in darkness. Executioners then carried or dragged this writhing bundle to the nearest body of water deep enough for complete submersion. The sack was thrown in and held under until all movement ceased within it completely. The condemned drowned while being bitten, scratched, and constricted by panicked animals sharing the confined space during final moments. The tunica molesta wrapped condemned persons in cloth soaked thoroughly with pitch and other flammable substances. This garment was set alight and ensured flames spread evenly across the entire body rather than concentrating in single areas only. The fabric adhered to flesh as it burned, making removal impossible even through desperate efforts by the victim. Immurement sealed living people inside walls or small chambers with no exit or opening for air circulation. Builders constructed the enclosure around the standing victim brick by brick while they watched their tomb take shape. Death came slowly through dehydration and oxygen depletion over several days of absolute darkness and isolation from all humanity. Damnatio Detil sent the condemned to labor in mines until their bodies failed completely from exhaustion and toxic exposure. Condemned miners worked underground in tunnels too narrow to stand upright and too poorly ventilated to breathe without difficulty. Average survival time in Spanish silver mines ranged between several months and 2 years, depending on conditions. Why Rome's brutality worked: the empire maintained control over 50 million people spread across 3 continents using military forces that never exceeded 400,000 soldiers at peak strength. This mathematical impossibility became reality through psychological dominance that made physical force largely unnecessary in daily governance of provinces. Subject populations internalized the consequences of resistance so completely that most never considered opposition as a genuine option available to them. The mind itself became occupied territory where Roman authority resided permanently without requiring constant reinforcement through actual violence. A single demonstration of capability every few years reminded entire regions what machinery existed for those who forgot their place. The precision of Roman cruelty distinguished it from the random violence of other ancient powers and medieval successors. Each method matched specific offenses in ways that created logical systems rather than chaotic terror without pattern. This rationality made the violence comprehensible and therefore more effective at shaping behavior across diverse populations. Documentation and public record-keeping ensured that punishments achieved reach far beyond those who witnessed them directly in person. Official accounts circulated through administrative channels, while unofficial stories spread through merchant networks and military transfers. The empire became saturated with knowledge of what happened to those who challenged its authority anywhere. Modern scholars examining Roman punishment systems recognize sophisticated understanding of human psychology at work throughout their design. Fear operates most effectively when paired with certainty rather than randomness in application of consequences. Rome provided that certainty through consistent responses that populations could predict and therefore avoid through compliance. The empire eventually fell to forces beyond any punishment system, as ability to deter or defeat through intimidation alone. But for half a millennium, these methods held together the largest political entity the Western world had ever known until that time. What the Romans did to dissenters worked exactly as intended for longer than most nations exist.